Okay, so we are live. Good morning, good morning. We want to thank all of you for joining the mayor, the city manager, the task force, and we have several of our council people with us. Alderwoman Pindell Charles is here, Alderwoman Tierney, Alderman Arnett, and I believe Alderman Payon was going to join us. Did I miss anyone? Not yet. So this morning, you're going to hear your team members who will be sharing all of the progress that each one of these task force members have worked very hard to bring us. We have areas of agreement, several areas, and we have some areas for further discussion. We will hear from all of the presenters, then we're going to break out into your working teams. They will be the same as you have had throughout the process. Everybody will have an opportunity to have their comments heard and to have healthy discussion. Robust is what we call this, robust discussion. And then we will report back out and see where we are at the end of the meeting, what areas we have agreement in, what areas, thanks. Thanks very much. Julian is bringing me some water. And what areas we have further need for further discussion. We're going to try and stay right on time. I know several people have a hard stop at noontime. So with that said, I am going to turn this over to the mayor.
I just want to say thank you to everybody on this task force. You know, as our city evolves, I know that we all realize that one of the defining things about this town is maritime industry, and it's why we live here. So I want to thank you for handling this with the sensitivity you're handling it with. I want to thank Alderman Arnett for taking this on. It was never going to be easy, and I really appreciate your efforts in tackling a really big moment in the city's history. So thank you to everybody for giving their time. This city would be nowhere without the volunteerism that I see all around me. So I just want to say thank you again. I know we're going to get to a good place when we come up with your findings, and I'm looking forward to moving all these things forward. Thank you all.
Thanks very much, Mr. Mayor. The city manager has some comments for us. I just wanted to see if any of the council wanted to make any brief comments before we move on to the city manager.
We're looking forward to hearing your work.
Great. That was all, Alderman Arnett. Thank you. David, your comments. Next slide.
Thank you, Eileen, and thank you all for participating in this. We really appreciate the time and effort. We know that you're all very busy and don't have a lot of free time, but thank you for participating in this effort. I'm just going to very briefly review the objectives of the task force, kind of set the stage for the work that's going to be done today. So first is to develop a cohesive strategy for maritime, taking into account the resident expectations, maritime industry needs, and the property owner's interests. And at the time, those are not aligned. So that's the difficult job that you all are doing to try to align all of those different stakeholder requirements. Second is to build a consensus that will serve as a basis for the maritime districts. And finally, the maritime approach developed by this task force is depend on each and every aspect of the strategy. So we can't break off parts of it. It needs to be a whole. Each of the building blocks is really required to make the whole work. So just ask you to keep that in mind as you move forward, that this is a building process and each of the blocks is needed to make sure it stands. So I will, with that, thank you again and turn it back over to Eileen.
Thanks so much, David. Next slide, please. I know all of you on the task force are aware of this, but for the public who is watching, I just wanted to set the context this whole approach that we, the task force, are working through now is tied to the 1987 Maritime District Strategy. And the basis of the approach is it's based on a concept that within the maritime districts, within our waterfront, there are working activities that are crucial and support the rest of the boating industry. Boat yards, areas where there's room to put on-land storage, 30-ton lifts. We've added to this recently with fuel docks. But these are functions and services that feed the rest of the industry. And the concept in 1987, which we are building upon, was that these activities are critical. They cannot go away. If they go away, so do all of the ancillary services that depend on them. And it was with that concept in mind that the idea of providing some limited non-maritime uses would be offered to those sites in order to maintain these working yards and working activities. So when we talk this morning about triggers, triggers are those sites that have these large, significant working maritime activities. Those sites will get additional non-maritime uses in order, if you will, to sustain the uses that are so critical to the rest of the industry. Slips are important, but slips alone cannot support all of the working maritime. So the concept is that we have identified triggers, which you will hear a lot of discussion about this morning, which are the basis of providing the kind of service that the rest of the maritime industry is dependent upon. Next slide, please. Over the last, really starting with the end of November, the task force reached quite a bit of general consensus by the end of January. General consensus in that there was agreement to support the districts and to support the structure of the districts, agreement to create programs to promote and grow the industry, to identify uses that contribute to the industry that should be endorsed, to tie future flexibility, which flexibility means any uses that are not maritime, to very significant triggers, and to incentivize water access. Next slide, please. These initial conclusions, which came out of the task force by the end of January, have then been presented over the last 2 months to the council, the planning commission, both Eastport Civic and the civic associations in Ward 7. And then within that, there have been meetings of all of the working groups, as well as topical meetings of the task force on restaurants, on water access, strengthening the industry, on parking. So out of all of this work, let's move to the next slide, brings us to where we are today. Today, we are that third big blue circle on the top. This is our third task force meeting. There have been many, many more working team meetings than you see on this graph, but you all know that because you've been participating in it. So we will try and reach some agreement, conclusions today on a variety of topics. And depending on where we come out the end of the day today, we may have more working team meetings, but we will definitely be going to the Planning Commission this month. We will definitely be going to the City Council next month, and there will be a lot of work for the task force over the next month or so, fleshing out some of the details as we get ready to take our initial findings forward. Next slide, please. So with that said, the most important aspect of this whole effort is the input of the residents, the owners, and the maritime industry. We want to kick off with hearing from the residents But as we go forward, it's really important to understand exactly what David said, that the strategic approach only works insofar as the interest of each of our stakeholder groups is expressed in our final product. I'm going to turn this over to Vic. Next slide. Vic Pasco.
Sorry about that. You'd think I'd understand that by now. I'm Vic Pasco. I live in Eastport, and we have met several times to talk about what residents envision. And some of the things that we are interested in are strong support for the maritime districts. I think most of us live here because of the interaction that we have with the maritime districts. We are interested in keeping the working yards because they offer openness, they offer views to the water, and we like to see the maritime industry at work. Land intensive uses, working yards, that we're supportive of that. They're also compatible with sea level rise, should that become a problem in the future. We believe that we need to maintain critical mass for the industry and the working maritime activity. And we do not support residential uses, hotels, or redevelopment of the waterfront. Residents would like to greatly expand waterfront access, meaning the public having access to the water. We feel like there's ways to incentivize water access activities, incentives to benefit the community, possibly with a promenade or some sort of accessible waterfront promenade. We would like to see creation of a network of connecting activities at some of the street-end parks, and public access at all city-owned properties. Next slide, please. Parking, it's always an issue. We're always trying to figure out how to deal with parking. We feel like there's opportunities here to address parking because some of the maritime zones have parking that's not used all the time that we might be able to share. So we want to start looking at that. And we want to create some incentives for the providing of residential and business parking. Restaurants, we talked extensively about restaurants. There's general support. I'd say high support for restaurants in the WMI zone. These restaurants would be limited to these larger sites who have significant triggers and working yards, and the restaurants must accommodate and not disrupt working maritime activities, meaning we got a lot of commentary that some of the larger yards can't have people coming and going through their yards. So we have to figure out a way to get these restaurants accessible to the public, but also to allow the working maritime activities to occur. I think that's the end of my presentation.
So I think that sounds terrific. Let's go with the next slide, and we have Wendy. Slide after this for Wendy O'Sullivan, who is Superintendent of our National Park Service for Chesapeake Bay. Wendy?
Great, thanks. Good morning, everyone. Wendy O'Sullivan, Superintendent of NPS Chesapeake. Been really great to be part of this process. Our subgroup really focused on water access and the different opportunities that are already in place and those that we can look at in the future. We covered the different types of access to the water, both being able to get up near and sort of view water, to actually get out on the water, to come into Annapolis from the water. And all the ways that we can look at that, we really focused on both the ways to connect across the different districts. And, you know, something that I'd like to just share and make a proffer on is that NPS Chesapeake is interested in supporting the city and this effort to take the next step related to water access. And what we see from the Park Service is the good work that this subgroup did. The next step that we see is to do a full-blown public access plan, looking at previous access plans that have been done, taking the views that we're looking at here, and developing a public access plan that is focused on water access, but is really more comprehensive than that, and includes pieces of alternative transportation, intermodal access. So, you know, I think it's a pretty significant planning effort to do that and to be holistic and comprehensive for the city. I am ready to bring NPS Chesapeake Gateway dollars to that. In the fall timeframe is when I'd be able to bring some funding to this. We'd be looking to find some additional dollars to help match the NPS funds. But we're really excited to, because of the good work of this team, really begin to frame out the scope to do a really world-class public access plan with in partnership with the city.
Wendy, thank you so much. That is just terrific. And when we break into our groups, some of the groups may want to give some thought as to what we want included in what's going to be our next step, which is this water access strategy. Thank you so much for that announcement. Mike, you got a tough act to follow after that. Next slide.
Always, Eileen. Thank you, everybody. Mike Tomasini, my wife and I own and operate Pirate Adventures on the Chesapeake out of Eastport. I'm a Maritime tenant. I'm also a resident in Eastport. Part of this discussion, I think, as it's evolved, has kind of highlighted, you know, some of the real gems in the city, but also some of the places where those gems could use a little bit of polishing. So what we're talking about when we're expanding waterfront access for the community members, we're talking about, number one, making these sites more visible. I mean, you're a new resident in Eastport, you might not know that at just about the end of every street out on the peninsula, you can access the water. It's not necessarily well marked, and in some cases, it's being overgrown, and you can't really tell what it's there for. So we've talked about coming up with an inventory of those sites, advertising them within the community, distinguishing them by what they're good for. Is one a good place to put a line in the water and catch some perch? Is another a good place to launch a paddle craft? So we're talking about making these uses safer and also more well-defined. Part of the objective has been that if we're gonna try and make real improvements, we're looking for opportunities to provide new street end parks or new public-private opportunities for people to get access to the water. We're gonna create as many boaters as we can. Those initial steps, the paddle craft, the stand-up paddle boards, those seem to be the entry level for boaters in this area. Next slide. We've also discussed what we can do as an incentive package for the property owners to make real investments into the community that are going to benefit the residents. And we've come up with kind of a hierarchy based on what kind of community impact they would have. So in that first tier at the top there, you see what we've considered to be the community game changers. And there have been a lot of discussion over this, but we feel like the biggest impacts, right off the top impacts that would make Annapolis a better community is investments into street end parks that are usable for multi-uses. And then also a community boating facility. That's going to include access to the water for people, for residents to store their kayaks on the water as opposed to throwing them on the top of their car and having to drive to a launch point. We're talking about boat racks, lockers, bathrooms, that kind of facility we think would be a real game changer for the community. And then we've also talked about, because some of these properties, these maritime properties have parking available that could be made available either to residents or potentially employees of local businesses, if we're able to get a significant amount of vehicles off of the street, that's a real game changer for the community. And then you can see the second tier. We've talked about the waterfront promenades, the affordable boating options, and other ways to get out on the water, like tour operators. Next slide, me. Is this me, Eileen, or is somebody else?
Well, this is you. This is one of Eric's slides. And if we want, Eric, if you want to take, whether Mike, you can do it as well, just what it would all entail to have a community boating facility, that it's, you know, the kayak launch, the lockers. The idea is here is the kind of thing when we talk about a community boating facility that we expect to see, with storage, with lockers, with dedicated parking. And then the next slide is an example of a promenade. Eric, do you want to touch on these?
Sure. I would just, in the discussions that we had regarding waterfront access, what we came to in terms of these community game changers were the things that we don't have currently, the things that when you look at other cities that have world-class waterfront access opportunities, this is one of those things. It's a way to expand public access to people who feel inhibited to get on a paddle craft. You could have programs that could really bring other demographics to the water. It could be revenue generating, so it doesn't have to be just a charitable venture, but it should have programs as part of it, and it should have some minimum dedicated parking to make it easy for folks to visit. And so the next slide would be
Promenade.
Yeah. So, in looking at ways to activate the waterfront, particularly on parcels that don't have the hard maritime, we're looking at models from other places that Annapolis could learn from, and places where you have promenades over water on piers, promenades along the bulkhead, where it's more about demarcating the place where it's safe for a pedestrian to walk, and has signage that connects people to businesses, to nearby streets, to parks and paddle launches. Really, trying to connect everything so that it's not a series of properties along the waterfront that don't have anything to do with each other, but are part of this larger concept of improved waterfront access. So that's kind of what we're kind of moving towards.
Great slides, Eric. Eric's got Wilmington there, and he also has, I think, Stockholm in the bottom. Next slide, and we're going to turn this to Susan. Following slide, please.
Morning, everybody. Susan Zellers, Marine Trades Association of Maryland. So now it's about the industry and how we keep it strong. Eileen's early slides were perfect. We're at a place where we're at a critical point of making sure we maintain that maritime, those working yards and services, in order to really continue the maritime hub that we've created here today. Slips alone are just not the key to the industry's future. We need to make sure we maintain the services, storage, the working yards in order to go into the future. Next slide, please. So what we've agreed on are the uses and triggers that are needed in order to continue. Uses have to support the health of the maritime industry. And through a lot of discussion, we've come to where we believe that restaurants have been identified as contributing uses if they're located in working yards and are servicing the slip holders, the transient boaters, and the workers in the yard. The triggers that allow for these restaurants or any non-maritime of any kind must be essential to the survival of the industry. And the triggers that Eileen went over earlier, the 30-ton lift, the on-land boat storage, working yard, and a fuel dock. Next slide. So after a lot of discussion, we came to some ideas for what the task force recommends to support the industry and to continue to promote Annapolis as the Mid-Atlantic Center for Maritime Service and for recreation. Incentives for new maritime uses and activities in each of the districts. Potential relocation assistance for maritime businesses locating from out of state. Incubator space built for new technology, new initiatives. Expansion of the workforce development efforts to reach a more diverse worker population. A commitment from the city to reach out and promote available maritime spaces by advertising what Annapolis offers maritime tenants and boaters. And streamlining the permitting for winter maritime activities and other routine dock and bulkhead replacement. And further, to continue exploration of blue technology, how it'll fit into maritime industry space and complement our existing industry. I think that's the end of my slides. So how do we pay for all these great ideas? I'm going to hand it over to John Hammond.
Thank you, Susan. And as you can see from this slide, these are some potential funding sources that we've talked about that might be applicable to this fund. Clearly, one of the primary guidelines is these funding sources not place an added burden on city taxpayers. So one of the concepts we've talked about is to sort of create an informal tax increment district from the maritime zones, and to use the assessments at a date. This slide says January 22nd, 2021. Really, more appropriate date would be January 1 of 2021. That's when the assessments from the State Department become effective on an annual basis on January 1. But the concept there is, okay, we'll take the high water mark of the assessments on January 1, and then any future growth over the years, that growth in assessments would generate property taxes in the normal course of events, and the city would sign up to designate that incremental revenue from the growth in the assessments to this fund. Other thoughts of funding this are to increase the city's charges for rental slips at the city dock and the mooring buoys out in the anchorage areas in the various creeks. These are just some suggested numbers that were thrown out and obviously would need much more discussion. Another concept is a space permit fee that would be applicable to those non-maritime uses that take advantage of whatever incremental non-maritime space comes out of this study. Right now, we've been talking about a 15% of expansion of non-maritime uses. So to the extent that that space was utilized for non-maritime uses in the future, there would be an applicable space rental fee of an amount to be determined that would then generate funds for this fund. Other potential sources of funding would be to tap into the hotel tax revenue that the Anne Arundel County Visitors Bureau receives on an annual basis, to maybe have some sort of an annual allocation of a portion of those revenues for this fund, because obviously the maritime industry is an important generator of visitors to Annapolis. And then thirdly, or lastly, other grants from various sources, the National Park Service, Anne Arundel County Economic Development, and anyone else out there that might be able to come up with a grant from time to time. We've had a lot of discussion about this fund, about the uses and about who pays into it, and more work probably is definitely needed to get a better handle on how much money actually be generated and whether it is a worthwhile endeavor. With that, I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
Thanks so much, John. Lots of creative ideas. And the next slide, Rod Jabin.
Yeah, good morning. I'm Rod Jabin. I'm the owner of the Jabin Yacht Yard. Many of my pictures are displayed in these slides, but I'm really been one of the sites that are hard maritime in the WMI zone. And I'm here to talk about the uses that contribute to the success of hard maritime activities. And one of the areas that we've identified is this idea of restaurants. And I know we've talked a lot about restaurants, but the idea is that the whole marina experience has really changed in the last 25 years. And we're trying to create a better experience for the transient boater as well as the full-time resident boaters, so they never have to leave the marina to enjoy their stay. And it complements the workforce. I mean, just in the Jabin Yard in the WMI, we probably have 200 to 250 employees that are working here every day that are looking for, food and services, as well as just the transient nature of the marine industry, where there's lots and lots of people that are looking for that restaurant service during the day while their boat's being serviced, and so that they can get a bite to eat or a cup of coffee. So the idea is that it's going to be contributing to the success of the marinas and not competing with anything else. There's also this idea of leveling the playing field, which is Anne Arundel County currently allows restaurants to as a use in marine facilities, and it's really hard to compete with that. As you know, down on Edgewood Road is the dividing line between the county and the city, and for our people that are in a WMI, right across the street is Chesapeake Harbor, that has a very nice, modest restaurant and outdoor dining that is really, really hard to compete with. And we're looking to enhance that from what is currently allowed in Annapolis, which is a facility with less than 10 seats. So that's very challenging to bring that. So we have broad agreement to allow modest restaurants up to 4,000 square feet in the WMI district. And we think that that's a good fit, subject to all the standards at City Dock for outdoor dining and noise, as well as parking standards for restaurants. But we think that we have the space and scale to accommodate all those in the WMI. If we go to the WME, there's less consensus with the WME, frankly, because of the density of Eastport. So there's still discussions ongoing in WME, but we have not reached a consensus. Next slide. Restaurants in WMM, as you are aware, is already allowed with outdoor dining. And there's several, just to look at the success that those restaurants have is an indicator of how well received it would be in the WMI zones. Other things that contribute to the success of the maritime zones is this idea of outdoor venues, drawing boaters and supporting the boatyard activity, which is meeting spaces and outdoor gathering places, areas to create an exercise area for floor exercises that people have really gravitated to, especially on or near the water. It creates a very unique setting. Additional complementary uses that some are already in existence, but we want to support is this idea of a small format grocery store and convenience to provision the boats and stuff as they come and go from the marina. An opportunity to support the maritime civic and social organizations. Again, a lot of these are in existence today, but the idea of pool and recreation and exercise facilities is becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. The idea of this resort community for marinas continues to be take on a bigger and bigger role. And the concept of on-water food and non-food service vessels. The one thing that we have not yet received a consensus on is the idea of small inns. We really don't know how that's going to fit in with the community or or anything else. So that again is another one that's going to take a lot more discussion to reach consensus on. Next slide, please. So this whole idea of what we're talking about are areas to strengthen the maritime industry. And it's a very complicated issue because if you look at our site here on Edgewood Road, I have 17 acres of hard maritime. If we look at the WMM, they're very small sites that are, some of them are mostly office buildings. And so that's where this idea of sustainability comes in with the addition of non-maritime tenants. They're mostly office buildings over there. But in order to create this sort of feeling of additional non-maritime tenants, we want to make sure that the triggers are in place. And without the triggers, you're not going to qualify for that increase in non-maritime zones. The triggers, which is a kind of a funny and confusing name, but it really is those items that are critical to the success of the marine industry. And we're talking about boatyards with a 30-ton boat lift, 20,000 square foot working space for hauling boats and working on boats, 25,000 square feet of on-land boat storage, and the idea of a fuel dock. It's critical to have a fuel dock. And we talked about removing boat clubs, but the idea of boat clubs is important, and they're very active here in Annapolis, and it's becoming a big thing. So while seafood processing has really disappeared in Annapolis, the boat club thing is good. But what we've identified is if your facility in all the zones have these significant triggers that have been identified, then we're recommending a 15% increase in non-maritime use, so that these bigger facilities like Annapolis City Marina and others in WMM have an opportunity to continue to be full in their office zones so that they can continue their maritime operations like the fuel dock and the slips and everything else that is what makes Annapolis so special. Next slide, please. Will, do you want to take the incentives?
Will, you're up.
Rod, thanks, but you're doing a great job.
It's your turn, Will.
Your turn, Will.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to say that I appreciate being given the opportunity to be part of this group. You've heard all of these presentations and you've heard how articulate they are, and I hope you understand all the work that's gone behind it. This is a time, unfortunately, in our community life, our national life, where there have been all kinds of strenuous difficulties and very pronounced divisions. But this group, as you've seen, represents the main constituencies of our community, Annapolis, that are affected by the existence and the survival and success of the maritime industry. So what I think is the big takeaway from what has been said by others before me is that in this time, we have been a group of citizens with very diverse interests and priorities, but we have worked together thoughtfully. We have come up with these specific proposals that have been presented to you today. And I think that we've come up with a strategy that is going to be effective. But again, as almost every speaker, or perhaps every speaker has mentioned, the incentives or triggers rather for the incentives are the real trigger. If you take them away or you chip away at what they currently are presented to the entire group, this could turn into something of a house of cards. And we have a limited time frame. We have an immediate need to make progress in supporting the maritime industry. I think that I was asked to participate because I was a member of the Planning Commission 30 some years ago when they were created. They functioned tremendously well. you can see the kind of people that have been involved in the industry, the residents that enjoy these services and are affected by them. I think that we all need to remember that it's part of our heritage as Annapolitans. It's part of our present, and we want it to continue to be an important part of our future. So when we break out, I think we need to be conscious of the work that's gone into it, the importance of this work, and the time frame by which we need to act. So thank you for giving me the chance to speak.
Thanks so much, Will. And what I'd like to do with Will's wonderful comments is just summarize a couple of these additional points for everyone. Let's go back one slide, Julian. So we've talked a lot about the triggers, the incentives. The concept behind the incentives are that they would be in addition to the 15% non-maritime that is being recommended in association with working yards. The incentives would only be offered in conjunction with public waterfront access or community benefits. Mike talked a little bit earlier about the first tier being street end parks, community boating facilities, parking availability, and that would receive the largest incentive. The second tier would be things more like dedicated boat slips for fire or promenade. So you have essentially two levels of incentives. The issue for discussion in your working groups today is the issue of what is going to be the maximum amount of incentive you want to see. In the WMM, which is our Spa Creek district in Eastport, there's been discussion where people have ranged from not wanting more than a total of 45% non-maritime, which is what you would get with adding the trigger, to some people have said they'd like to see 60% non-maritime, but the range is basically between 50 and 55%. But that is for you all to discuss today. Next slide, please. Today, what you're going to have are the industry, the residents, the property owners. Each has a lot of agreement, but there are different perspectives, needless to say, from each of these groups. Let's go to the next slide. And when you look at the areas of agreement, it's amazing. Agreement with almost everything that's been presented so far. The 15% additional non-maritime, the support, at least in WMI, for the restaurants, the support across the board for venues, supporting aggressively programs and funding for the industry, shared parking and a consistent parking ratio, and the incentives for water access. And that leaves us with the next slide, which is what are the areas where there is still not agreement. Restaurants in WME, you will hear from the residents, certainly some concern about that. And that's something for you all to discuss today. How much do you want to provide or offer for these incentives? That will be a major part of the discussion. There also is not agreement as to whether there should be any inns allowed in any of the areas to date. And then the incentives, do you want to basically encourage just some game changers, or do you want to encourage a variety of smaller incentives? So these are the areas for which we do not have agreement, but I feel confident, seeing all the people on this call, that we're going to have a terrific, robust discussion. Next slide. Will spoke to this, and that is that what we hope to emerge with is a direction that benefits everybody. And what's most important is what David said earlier, that these recommendations move together cohesively as an action strategy. You've heard from Wendy. We've already, with her tremendous generosity and support, will be taking action on the water strategies. We need to take action on each one of these elements. And with that said, I'm going to ask that Julian is going to put you into your working groups. Wendy, you will be in the water access group. John Hammond, you're going to be in the group with Rod Jabin and Will Scott. Okay, we got everybody back. Let's start with the sustainability group, which is Rod, Will, and whomever else you want to speak on behalf of your group.
Thanks, Eileen. Is there any way to get slide 28 up on the screen?
Yeah, bear with me 1 second.
So while he's doing that, what we were trying to do in our group is gain consensus into areas of agreement on these certain areas, and we believe that we have in our working group consensus with these bullet points here: strong support to keep the maritime districts in structure, continue significant triggers for increase in non-maritime, 15% additional non-maritime, support for contributing uses, restaurants and venues, mid-scale restaurants and WMI, aggressively support programs and funding for the Annapolis maritime industry, support for shared parking and consistent package ratios, and support for additional incentives for water access. We're still discussing, the amount of non-maritime that would be allowed for these various incentives, but it's encouraging, and we're making progress there. If you go to the next slide, 29. What we're really focused on in our group is where should this maximum non-maritime land with incentives. And as Eileen pointed out earlier in the discussion, it is somewhere between 45 and 55, and we need a little bit more discussion to come to a consensus on that. But in general, I believe that we've made real progress here today.
Great, great, great. And thank you so much. Let's see where everybody else is, then we'll figure out what our next step is. Why don't I go to Vic and Mike and your team?
Mike, I'll take it.
Yeah, because I was in and out. I missed a lot. So
Okay, I think we're at more of a standstill. We got to talking about especially the WMM, Annapolis City Marina, being sort of the outlier because it's has a lot of office space, and it seems like they have some hard numbers that they really don't want to go below, and the residents and others have numbers that differ from that. So I think we're going to need some more discussion on that.
Did your group in general agree with let's put that slide back up, number 28, Julian, with the things that we have heard agreement on throughout the process?
Yeah, we didn't specifically talk about that slide again, but my feeling, unless somebody says something different, I feel like overall we've been in support of everything on that list. I think Bob Waldman was talking with me at the end about shared parking. And yes, I think we support shared parking, but there's got to be a way to get people to go to the shared parking. So for example, let's just say Annapolis City Marina is willing to share its parking lot with the residents of Eastport. It took us a while just to get the city to put a sign up that even said that there was parking available there. And so we've got to get people to push into that sort of thing, or else they're just going to park on the street like they always do, and they're going to park as close as they can to whatever it is they're using. So we've got to figure out a way to make that more accessible, put signage, whatever we have to do. And, I'll repeat again that Eastport has never really been in favor of permitted parking, mainly because of the boating industry, the sailors who come here and want to park for 2 or 3 days. And in general, the Eastport residents support that. And it's so I don't think that's a way that we can get people to move into shared parking. So we got to figure that out.
Okay, let's put up the other slide. I want to figure out from each group the areas where we need to do more work together. One is shared parking. On the issue of restaurants in WME, I'm assuming your group was not supportive of that, or is that an assumption that's not correct?
I think we didn't have enough time to get into that specifically, but what I'm hearing from other leaders in the community is that we're not in favor of restaurants in WME at this time.
Okay, and then in terms of, and I know there's a wide range, if you could just, how would you describe the range of opinions on incentives? And we may have to go a different route because we may not be able to get consensus on this. Were people mostly around 50? Were some people at 60? Were some people at 45? How would you describe the range, Vic?
I'd say it depends on who you talk to. It did range from 45 to 60. So we're still in a pretty big range.
Okay, great. And then the next group, and we can, let's go back to slide 28 and let's bring Susan Zellers and Scott Tinkler up.
Well, we have consensus on WMI, which I thought was, one small victory there of the 15% for triggers and an additional 5% for incentives. So that was WMI. We shut that door and moved on to WME. WME, there was not a full consensus on, other than keeping any restaurants in WME to the special exception process that's already in place, that's the best way for that to happen, of any size, any level, anything in WME, is leave it in the special exception so that more can weigh in and that sort of thing. WMM, we had a lot of discussions about the cap. Again, I guess we fall between 45 and 55 as everyone else does. Some of us felt strongly about the 50% being, the max, because then it becomes, is it maritime anymore if it goes over that? But there were some really good points also brought up about whether or not we would see some of those incentives happening. Why would they happen if it's only for an additional 5% in that level? So it might be that WMM, is a little bit different for incentive calculation.
Somebody has their.
I don't know. I need your opinion on that one.
Yeah.
Okay, Susan, I'm sorry. Could you say that again?
It just means we think that in WMM, it might be their incentives calculated differently than the other ones. And that's, I think, everything.
Great. Let's bring everybody up on the screen to the extent you can, so we can see the whole group. Okay, do we have everybody? I think we do. Let's see, we got everybody. So it looks like we have some of the areas of agreement. We are still, from what we heard when people were in their individual groups, we are still on track for, and it looks as though certainly the issue of restaurants in WME, there is not a consensus on that. And then it sounds as though we still have a wide range of perspectives on the incentives. What we'll do is I'll get back with all the co-chairs and we'll see if we can narrow down what this basically see where the middle is. I'll be meeting with the co-chairs either later this week or early next week. And then we'll get back with all of you to try and get into the areas that need more evaluation, the shared parking, and figure out what we want to do, because we don't want to hold the whole task force up over the issue of WMM incentives. Let's figure out if we have an area where we'll actually probably go and get people's votes and see if we can come up with something that represents the majority. So as always, you all have done a terrific job. To the co-chairs, thank you for all your heavy lifting. We will be getting together this week. To everybody else, we will be getting in touch with you by next week to start to dig into some of these areas that need more discussion, particularly parking. And then we will also ask the civic groups to go out and try in the next couple of weeks and get their feedback and see where we are. So all terrific. Thank you very much.